Hello lovely people, welcome to another book chat, the weekly roundup of stuff I have read at some point in the past.
Sophie Vlogs.
This week's book chat, we are talking about the books I read at the very start of 2020. So I'm going to kick off with the first book that I read this year, which is The Murderer's Ape by Jakob Wegelius, which is translated by Hang On a Biscuit. Translated from the Swedish by Peter Graves. This was a wonderful way to kick off the year. I have to thank Matt at MCS Books because he recommended this to me, and he also recommended that if possible I should just try and read it in like a moment that I could immerse myself. I think I read this in a day. I might have read this in 2 days. I can't entirely remember. But as I've mentioned in some of my previous videos, I'm better now, but I kicked off the new year with a horrendous cold. So in those first couple of days of the new year, when I was so ill and wrapped in a duvet, and I was like, I just want to be a slime ball all on my own, I read this book, and it was so wonderful. This follows Sally Jones. Hello, Sally Jones, who is a gorilla, but also a ship's engineer. Her best friend is the chief. She's the engineer on his ship. Essentially, they take on this I was going to say mission, not really a mission, like a job. A job, Sophie, that's what they're called. And things go wrong, and the chief ends up being imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. And then Sally goes on some very meandering adventures to try and free him and prove his innocence. One thing I loved about this is the world building. So we go all over the world in this. Its sort of central base point is Lisbon, and I have not been to Lisbon. I did watch a documentary, Art Lover's Guide documentary about Lisbon that made me want to go, and then reading this also made me want to go because I feel like he painted such a picture of these streets and this particular time that it made me want to go and see what it's like now. But essentially, Sally befriends some people, ends up going on this journey to find someone who can prove the chief's innocence. This takes her all over the place. She ends up in India for a portion of this. It also explored like engineering topics like ships, but then also like planes during this particular time period, which is like this I want to say like reign of Queen Victoria type era is what's happening. So he paints such a picture of everywhere that we're at along this journey, which is, I think, really helpful because this is a story that takes its time. It is a chunky book for a middle grade book, I get that. But I think the fact that you always felt like everywhere, well, I always felt like everywhere we visited in this, I felt very situated in the place. I understood what the place was like. Also aided by the fact that you have these maps as end papers, and then running throughout you also have these illustrations of all the people she meets along her journey, and then also illustrations at the start of every chapter, which all of this really helped build up this world, which I can imagine if you're reading this as like a 9 to 12-year-old will also really help you get to grips with what is a chunky book for a child to read. As well as that, I enjoyed all of the characters. I felt like there were Sally is a very endearing protagonist. She can't speak words, but she can understand speech and communicate through writing and stuff like that. So it is interesting having a story told to you by someone who is not able to actually talk to the other people in this. I don't know, I felt like it was an interesting focal point. And also the fact that she's a gorilla is a thing. As well as engineering, because Sally is an engineer, and I think that's really interesting, and I think it makes engineering sound really interesting for children, you also explore stuff like, music is a topic that runs throughout this, whether that's, there's a character who's a beautiful singer, there's a character who repairs instruments, stuff like that. And also just this whole mix of characters, there are such, I'm not going to say tropey characters in a bad way, but so far as like, you have there are duplicitous people in here. There are, I feel like it's riffing off of genres somewhat. There is a bit of a riffing off of like detective-y genres. There's a riffing off of this sort of Victorian novel type thing. And I felt like that is, that's not a negative thing, that's a deliberate thing that we're playing to a genre, and I enjoyed that. So, I'll stop babbling, because I feel like I am babbling. But suffice to say, I just felt like I got so immersed in this. I am glad I read it in like 1 or 2 sittings, because it made it all just feel very real. At the end of this all, I was just like, oh, there is no Sally Jones in my life. This is all a book. But I had a wonderful time. I thought it was really great. That was followed by some non-fiction. I read Singin and Swingin and Getting Merry Like Christmas by Maya Angelou. This is the 3rd book in Maya Angelou's autobiographical series. I previously didn't own this book, so I actually went from the 2nd book to the 4th book, so reading this is filling in that time in between, and that's an interesting thing to do, because I know where she ends up. So, like, the 4th book, which I had previously read, is very much Maya Angelou getting into her political activism, working for the organisation that Martin Luther King run, marrying a South African man and learning a lot more about the politics of South Africa at the time, stuff like that. So it was kind of weird flashing back in time into her life and then seeing the bit that happened before that. So the first half of this is a lot to do with trying to provide, she's a single mother with her son, all these different jobs she's doing. She was like a sort of like exotic dancer, that sort of thing. And then the latter half of this is her time on tour with Porgy and Bess, doing European tour, and how that absolutely blew up and all that sort of thing. That whole tour thing, so interesting. Porgy and Bess is, I'm familiar with it a bit. I would like to now actually just like listen to the music, watch the performances, that sort of thing, because I know a couple of songs from it, but I'm not super familiar. So it was very interesting to get the perspective of someone who is like in that when it is blowing up, and all that sort of thing. Even though she is not involved in the activism that she is involved in the 4th book, there is very much present in this a lot of political discussion. So although it is less of an organised aspect of her life, it is very much something which she is, or kind of, to be honest with you, forced to engage with, because she's existing as a black woman in this time when, like, you would very much still be openly discriminated against. And then also because she's travelling around Europe, she's contrasting the types of treatment they get in different places and the different attitudes, and places that might initially trick you by seeming to be more accepting than America is, but actually it's just because it's done, the discrimination comes out in a different way, that sort of thing. So I really enjoyed this focus on like music and stuff that ran through this. It was also always tempered by her experiences and stuff like that. I don't know, I just think that Maya Angelou is so masterful as a storyteller. I think that she has lived such a full life. Every time I read one of these, I don't read them too close together. I'm spacing them out because I don't want to, like, there's a finite number and I don't want to run out before I'm ready to finish this journey. But they're brilliant, and I would recommend them, yes. I'm going to go back to fiction and then end on a non-fiction again. So the next book is Soulless by Gail Carriger. This is the first book in the Alexia Tarabotti series. This is like a steampunky, detective-y series. I knew I was going to enjoy this. And again, because I was ill at the time, I needed something that I thought would be a lot of fun, that I didn't need to engage too much brain in. And this was a perfectly fun, enjoyable read. Alexia Tarabotti is soulless, so this is set in a world where the supernatural creatures are like part of society. So we're in Victorian society, but vampires exist, werewolves exist, and ghosts exist. Vampires and werewolves are very much a part of society. And in this world, supernatural beings are able to exist because of stuff to do with souls. So in this, like, supernatural creatures have like an excess of soul that is what makes them be supernatural. In contrast to that, Alexia is soulless, so she negates the effect of supernatural creatures. So like if a vampire is to touch her, they will become human for the amount of time that they are physically in contact with her. Which is an interesting setup. I found that very interesting. I also found it very interesting the way that these supernatural creatures are like weaved into the society. So this is Victorian society with all of its manners and rules and that sort of thing, and it just so happens that there are also manners and rules within werewolf society and within vampire society, and it's all interconnected. Alexia is attacked by this vampire, and it goes against all etiquette of the current time So they realize that this vampire is not one who's been claimed by any of the vampire like houses. And then the guy who's like head of police of the area is like a werewolf. And they're trying to solve the mystery. There's a heavy element of this that is like romance, like Alexia and this guy like getting together. And there's also an element of this that is like mystery solving. What is going on here? That sort of thing. There was I enjoyed how the mystery was playing out. I sort of called elements of it, but I also don't necessarily think that's a critique, because usually if it's a good mystery, you can figure it out because you've been given clues, rather than it's like, twist, this guy you've never met, which is annoying. This was more of like okay, I see threads coming together and I see where we're going, but I'm interested to see where we end up. I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars because I had a perfectly fun time reading it. I think there are a couple of niggles I had. One is that, like, mild spoiler, but it's not actually related to any of the plot. It's just a thing that happens later in the book. Queen Victoria pops up in this. I sometimes find it a little annoying in books that are set in like a historical time period, where just like out of the blue, this horrendously famous person comes in and like talks to you for like a reason that feels a little bit forced. So I had that kind of, I was like, really guys, are we doing this? And then also there was just, I don't know, there was a little bit of not like other girls going on at the edges, because Alexia is, her father was Italian, he's now died, and she lives with her mother and her mother's husband and their children, and there was quite a lot of like, oh, aren't these women silly, isn't Alexia like, oh, she's not silly like that, blah blah blah, oh, she has swarthy dark skin compared to everyone, all the vampires, super pale skin. I don't know, there was some elements of that which occasionally niggled me a little. I don't know, at the edges there was just, I would have liked it a little bit more if it was like, Alexia doesn't like to engage in all these feminine things, but like her sisters do, and that's kind of okay, rather than just like, oh, they're so silly and frivolous. God damn it, I don't know. I'm just going to skim over that. And the final book I'm going to talk about is super duper tiny. This is The Wood by Jon Stewart, Collis. This is actually an excerpt from a larger book that he did. I saw this in a second-hand shop, and I thought I'd pick this up because it would be a good way to know if I wanted to read more of Jon Stewart Collis. So during the Second World War, he was put on like agricultural duties, and he had to like fell trees in this wood. And it's just like based on, I think, the diaries he kept at the time. It's just exploring the wood and also the nature he's seeing and blah, blah, blah. I really liked the bits where he was talking about nature and about his observations of how this wood works and stuff like that. And about like learning about different trees and stuff like that was really interesting. Some of the bits I found less interesting is some of just he is a man of his time. He has certain views. He had some views about like, how can you look at all this stuff and not think that God exists? And I was like, I can do that. I'm fine with that. And then every now and then he would like rail against like, oh, this is like agricultural work, working the land, like this is the best work one can do. And then he would like rail against people who like didn't do stuff like that and who like did like jobs and blah blah blah. But then also he would be like, but of course I'm not going to do this all of my life. And I was like, you can't rail against people who don't do agricultural work and then be like, of course, I'm only doing this for this limited period of time and then I'm going to go back to being like a writer. Like, I don't know, but I do think he had some really valid points about our disconnect from nature that are very relevant now that we're living in a time of climate crisis, and we need to consume less and we need to have a better understanding of how to support our ecosystems and stuff like this to make sure that we don't go past the point of no return. He did have some very valid points, bearing in mind he's writing in the 40s. And so, like, hearing this perspective from the Second World War of someone being like, we're losing nature, we're losing wildlife, blah, 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 and you're like, we're still doing that. We've not made a change yet. Was at times both, like, interesting to get his perspective, but also, like, deeply sad, because look at where we're at. I don't know. It was very short. It's excerpts from throughout the book, so you get little snippets of different topics and little chapters and da-da-la-la. But it was intriguing. I don't know if I would read a whole large book by him. That's something I'm going to mull over. I think if someone gave it to me, I would. I don't think I would necessarily buy it. That's everything I wanted to talk about this week. As per usual, have you read any of these? Have you read anything that is like these that you think I might like to read? All of these discussions and more, do let me know in the comments down below. But otherwise, I will see you next time for something different.